Welcome to the Compliance Time, AML and Financial Crime podcast. Here, you can learn from compliance experts, enthusiasts and creators who are contributing to the fast-moving and dynamic field of financial compliance.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 7 of Compliance Time podcast. In this episode, we will discuss the importance of learning and focus on why and how compliance professionals can build competitive advantages and stand out from the crowd. Following a career in UK national law enforcement, specializing in transnational organized crime, money laundering and terrorist financing investigations, Dr. Ian Messenger now teaches several financial crime courses at universities and colleges in Canada. Ian is the course instructor for the Certificate in Financial Crimes Prevention and Mitigation offered online by Seneca College. If you have questions about the course, don't miss Friday, 10th of July. There will be Ask the Instructor session in which you can learn more about the certificate and ask any questions that you have. Follow the link in show notes. Welcome, Ian. Welcome to Compliance Time. We are very glad to have you here.
It's great to be here.
So let's jump with the questions. How did you start your career and what do you find to be the most exciting part in compliance?
That's a really great question, and I'm glad it's the first one because it really hopefully will showcase why I'm so excited to work in compliance. So unlike a lot of my colleagues in compliance, and unlike a lot of maybe your listeners, I actually started my career in law enforcement. I was a police officer for 10 years. And throughout those years, I actually started to move into investigating crimes related to money laundering and terrorist financing. So the final 6 years of my career, I was actually predominantly involved in money laundering and terrorist financing cases. So when I made the transition into the private sector and into teaching in 2016, and the logical next step was to move into compliance. So what I do these days is I actually teach courses on financial crime and on terrorist financing and terrorism more broadly. In terms of what I find the most exciting part of compliance, I think if I rephrase that slightly as to what I find the most exciting part of money laundering and terrorist financing, really I think it's the fact that there's so many moving parts involved in money laundering. It's a very complex crime. You know, we have our placement, layering, integration. There's so many things that are going on, and it takes a lot of effort sometimes, in many cases, to understand how all these parts fit together, how these certain money laundering schemes are being conducted, how we can identify ways of disrupting the flows of the proceeds of crime, the terrorist financing. So it's almost like it's an academic exercise as well. So that's what I find exciting, because when you have a really complex scheme and when you identify what's going on, it's a rewarding feeling.
That's true. And you're mentioning about teaching, so can you tell us more about the classes that you teach?
It's a great question. I actually teach a number of courses related to financial crime and related to terrorism. My main course, which I teach for compliance officers, is a certificate program through a college here in Canada. It's a 16-week course which is related to financial crimes prevention and mitigation. And this is thanks to COVID, it's going to be exclusively online. So it's 16 weeks of online lectures, basically 3 hours a week. There's live video conference lectures as we go through a range of different financial crimes. And I think really the motivation for this particular 16-week course is to give students a really strong understanding about what financial crimes they may intercept, because in order to prevent or mitigate a financial crime, we must understand exactly what is going on. So this particular course covers a range of crimes which are committed by individuals, by companies, and by the state as well. And we also look at the victim perspective as well, because the role of the victim, especially as compliance officers are increasingly dealing with fraud, it's very important to keep that victim-centric approach. So we look at victims of financial crimes as well. We look at, especially when it comes to fraud and scams, we look at those methods that fraudsters use to convince victims to part with their money. This particular program through Seneca College, the 16-week program, I was very conscious to make sure that it was appealing both academically and professionally. So one of my key observations in compliance is the role of certifications. So rightly or wrongly, industry here in North America certainly favors having certifications. So with this particular course, I've closely tied the course content, and indeed we speak upon it in lectures, to the CFCS certification, the Certified Financial Crime Specialist certification, which is my current favorite one. Mm-hmm. In terms of other courses, I have a course which is opening up to the general public, hopefully in the autumn or at a later stage next year, on terrorism. So I currently teach a course called Global and Domestic Terrorism, and it's part of a certificate and undergraduate program which is at Dalhousie University here in Canada. Because of the content, it has much wider appeal, and I'm currently going through the process of opening up this particular course to the general public, where students will learn about firstly, what is terrorism, how does terrorism apply in North America and globally, but we also have a look at terrorist financing as well, which I think will be really interesting to compliance officers.
That's true. And for the both courses, would you say that they're only for people in North America, or can be also for international students located somewhere else?
That is a very good question. It's a point I should have covered, so apologies for that. It definitely is suitable for international students. I really made a point of making it international when I was going through the course creation process, because with compliance, if we think about what money laundering is, we think about what terrorist financing is. It's an international activity. If we look at those compliance officers here in Canada, certainly we have a lot of newcomers to Canada. We have a lot of individuals who don't come originally from Canada. So really, this particular course also serves as an introduction to Canada. It will also give students a Canadian program on their resume as well. So I'm actually holding an Ask the Instructor session virtually in July, and as of this morning, I see students from across the globe. There's a number of potential students from Europe, from the Asian subcontinent, and also North America. So I think one of the nice features of having a virtual course is that we can have students from around the world joining in.
This is true, and I think it would be very, very valuable for many people who are not maybe in North America, but are really interested to learn, to be able to enroll and be part of the course. And speaking about learning, what do you think, in your view, how would you describe the importance of learning in AML and compliance?
Yeah, the role of learning, I think, is really important for compliance officers, both personally and professionally. And I think it's important to separate the two. I think from a professional perspective, the methods and techniques used by criminals and terrorist financiers are constantly evolving, and they're always one step ahead of compliance, both in law enforcement and also the private sector. So really keeping up to date on current topologies, current trends is crucial for an effective compliance officer. I think also, if we look at what compliance is, there was historically a position that compliance meant AML, whereas in my perspective, from my observations, compliance is multifaceted. We have AML, we have fraud, we have sanctions, and each of those aspects have their own nuances. They have their own specialisms and their own quirks. And I think a well-rounded compliance officer has to have really a strong understanding of all of these aspects. I think especially because the role of the compliance officer is changing in many financial institutions. Historically, we saw both in financial institutions and in the public sector, we saw a very siloed approach. You would have individuals working in AML, you'd have individuals working in fraud, you'd have individuals working in sanctions, and they would very much work independently. Mm-hmm. I've observed over the past several years, there's a convergence of these roles. So there's no longer separate departments. It's a combined compliance function. So also from a personal perspective, in order to keep yourself relevant and competitive in the labor market, it's important to have that constant learning mindset.
Yeah, I do think the same. I do think that to be a good compliance officer, no matter AML or maybe some other field of specialty like fraud, sanctions, as you mentioned, you really need to learn a lot and to keep current, because everything is evolving so fast. A scheme that was, let's say, relevant 2 years ago maybe no longer exists. So yeah, I think it's one of the hardest parts to not believe that you're a subject matter expert, no matter how many years you have spent in learning the same thing. So yeah, I am also on the same side here. And speaking of the learning opportunities, what would you say are the top 3 benefits for students enrolling in the courses that you teach? How would they benefit from them?
Here's my role as a publicist for my courses here, and I can assure the listeners there are definitely more than 3 reasons for taking my courses, but I will limit my answers to the top 3. I think in all of these courses I've outlined, what I've strived to do is enable the student to develop a strong foundation. So whether it's a strong foundation in financial crime prevention and mitigation, or a strong foundational understanding in terrorism. If we go back to the importance of developing a strong foundation in financial crime, in my 16-week course, I really stress the importance of understanding predicate offences and the underlying activity which comes as a precursor to the money laundering offence. And with these particular courses, I'm very keen to have a two-way conversation, a two-way communication as the course goes on. I think a lot of other courses which are held virtually or certification courses, it's very much one way. There is pre-written learning material. A student maybe just sits in front of their computer for several hours reading the material, taking a test. With my courses, I have, as I outlined earlier, live video sessions on a weekly basis where I really encourage question and answer session. Each session is organic, so it will be tailored to the students in the course, and I also use extensively up-to-date case studies as well. So these case studies hopefully will translate into the types of cases which the students are seeing in their professional work. I also think as a third option, as the third reason for taking my course, is that it's closely tied in with an industry certification as well. So those students who are taking the Financial Crimes Prevention and Mitigation Program, they will, upon completion, receive a certificate from a Canadian college, and they will also be in a very strong position to sit the CFCS certification exam, which, as I mentioned before, is my favorite certification at the moment because of its well-rounded compliance content. So I think those are the top three reasons. I would certainly be happy to spend several hours going through other reasons, but those are definitely the top three.
That's great. And I think it's very good that you mentioned about the live recordings and video throughout the course materials, because this is a benefit that people don't often realize. Like, for example, I was thinking that, all right, now it's more difficult due to COVID to meet, but networking as part of such video sessions and discussing with you and with the classroom or questions, I think would be really a great benefit for the course takers.
Yes, and I think it's a trend which will certainly continue, because this 16-week course, originally when it first ran in the earlier part of this year, did have several sessions which were in class in Toronto, which obviously does limit the number of students and the range of students who can attend, because you have to physically be in Toronto, in Canada. Obviously now moving purely online, it's really opened up the population. So as of this morning, I have students in Vancouver in Canada. I have some students in New York in the US who've signed up for this course. Because of the time difference being roughly the same, they can take advantage of the live sessions. Those live sessions are also recorded as well. So for those students coming from Europe or from Asia, they can certainly still attend the course and view the recorded lectures if they're not able to attend because of time zone.
Yeah, that would be great to be able also to see a recorded version in case you missed for some reason. But speaking of your experience, would you be able to share with us a case involving terror financing or some knowledge about the topic?
It's a really great question. I think it's a very relevant question, because we talk a lot about money laundering case studies, but we don't often talk about case studies involving terrorist financing. And it's really important to understand that there is a difference between the two. With terrorist financing, we have a very straight line approach to the activities. It's very linear. The objective of terrorist financing is to fund terror, whereas obviously money laundering is to launder the proceeds of crime. So the individual who commences the terrorist financing linear process will not be the recipient of the funds at the end. So I think that's a really good a distinction to make early on. In terms of case studies, I did search long and hard for a case study that I could talk about. Obviously, working in law enforcement in that particular space, it's hard to give specifics, but I did find an example which I could remove some particulars, and we can talk about some of the aspects of that case. And it really, I hope, highlights to those listening some of the cautionary flags or the red flags that do often appear in terrorist financing cases. So in this particular case, it actually came as a referral from a financial institution into my law enforcement agency, where the financial institution had observed several common red flags which related to terrorist financing, namely that there were a lot of cash deposits made in multiple branches, both within the city where the account was open, but also across the country as well. So we're talking about in the UK. There's a lot of bank-to-bank transfers from other individuals in the UK. And these deposited funds were then being wired out to charities and corporations in several Middle Eastern countries. In the referral from the financial institution, they had kindly also included some of the external research they had conducted on the beneficiaries of these funds, and there were some negative news relating to certain charities, certain individuals who were potential matches to individuals on the OFAC list, which completely prompted a referral to law enforcement. When the case came to me, I myself and my team started to make some inquiries, and we conducted our investigation. We uncovered a network of financiers in the UK, both from a facilitation perspective, but also those individuals who had sympathies and were involved in fundraising at the local level. At a later stage, after dealing with the UK side of things, I and my team, we engaged with our overseas colleagues in those regions to make sure that action could be taken with the beneficiaries. But I think in this particular case, and this is kind of a general case when it comes to terrorist financing, I think the key takeaway here was the role of the disclosure from the financial institution. I think the quality of the SAR that was completed by the compliance officer at the financial institution really attracted interest. It caught the attention because, as you can imagine, there's so many SARs that get filed with regulators around the world. It's hard often to identify the ones which have high intelligence value that need actioning straight away versus those which are maybe slightly more defensive or slightly weaker. So really, this was a very good example of a compliance officer who knew their role in the process. They knew what terrorist financing was, and they knew how to escalate.
This is a very interesting point because just recently I had a discussion about storytelling in compliance and in preparation of compliance reports or SARs. But I was just wondering if you can share what was that thing that made the SAR appealing or being taken out of the pile as something relevant?
That's a great question. I think you have answered that question actually for me. It's very much the storytelling. If you can imagine the role of a regulator and an employee or an officer of a regulator or the law enforcement agency who receives these referrals, they receive hundreds or thousands of these referrals every year, and time is limited. So if a referral is received and it's not clear, it's not concise, it's not readable, it's too confusing, much hard work almost. It certainly it may not get the most immediate attention. With this particular SAR, the storytelling really was very textbook. It was that there was a clear beginning, middle, and end, which clearly highlighted the concerns. It highlighted the red flags, and it made clear to me as a reader what the immediate action should be taken. It highlighted the risks, and that is the key thing, I think, is making sure that the reports which are submitted are clear. They highlight the risks to non-compliance readers as well, because an aspect which is commonly overlooked when SARs are being written by those in financial institutions is those individuals in law enforcement who will ultimately be reading these SARs may not have a financial investigation background.
Oh yeah. All right. This is really valuable. Thank you for sharing. I know that this next question is really sort of huge in trying to explain it, but because you had this experience from the lens of law enforcement and from a compliance perspective, what would you say is most important during the investigation of terror financing?
I think the most important aspect when we're looking at investigating terrorist financing is to be aware of the low cost of conducting the activity and also the timeliness of referring the activity to law enforcement or national security partners. The key thing I would advise and remind those working in compliance is, if you ever do encounter transactions that you think may be related to terror financing, is to really escalate those in line with your internal procedures to your law enforcement contact or your regulator, because of the low cost of activity, a transaction for a few $100s, a few £100, a few €100 could be sufficient to conduct a significant activity. It's also worth bearing in mind during the investigation that it's not a money laundering investigation.
Yeah.
And that's it's a point which may sound strange, but it's a point I encountered during my time in law enforcement, is that when people see a financial investigation, they often expect a return of funds. So they expect that eventually those funds which are progressing through the system will go back to the originator. Whereas really, as I mentioned before, in terrorist financing, the individual who commenced the movement of funds is not going to see these funds again. They've been sent for a specific purpose, and that purpose could be timely. So very much the role of escalating and acting upon information in a timely manner is what I would say is the most important aspect.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing. And in the podcast, we are always asking for a final question about the trends in AML and compliance in 2020. So what would be your take on that question? What is your view on the trends of this so turbulent year that we have?
Yes, it certainly has been a very turbulent year, and I think if you were asking this question pre-COVID, my answer would be very different. But here we are in June, so we're halfway through the year. We're in, I think, week 13 or 14 of our COVID lockdown. So I think certainly the outlook and the trend for AML and compliance in 2020 has changed because of COVID, frankly. And I think there's multiple aspects to that. I think because of the financial pressures on banking institutions, we'll start to see a further consolidation, I should say, of roles. So the previously separate AML departments, the separate fraud department, sanctions screening department, I can imagine those roles will start to be combined and consolidated into a more leaner compliance department. So again, really flagging up the need for compliance professionals who have a broad experience, a broad knowledge. So really, the continuous learning points I made earlier really are important here. Mm-hmm. I think compliance officers will also see changes in customer behavior as well, which may filter down to the types of reports which they receive from frontline staff, types of reports they receive from their transaction monitoring systems, because I can foresee, because of the physical and social steps and distancing that we have to go through, I can foresee, and I think we are seeing it now in some respects, less in-branch activity. So a lot more transactions being conducted online through online banking or through smartphone apps. So that will affect how compliance officers conduct their day-to-day jobs. I think in terms of the day-to-day jobs that and cases that compliance officers will see, we'll start to see more COVID-related scams. So this is two parts. I think we'll see new and emerging scams which haven't existed pre-COVID, but we'll also see those old, tried and tested, the 419, the advanced fee fraud scams continue to occur, but with a COVID narrative. So the COVID becomes part of the pitch to the victim as to why funds need to be said. And we might also see a rise in investment scams, because in addition to the general public having fears about COVID, individuals will also potentially start to experience financial hardships as the lockdown, as the pandemic goes on. So we might start seeing more vulnerable customers banking with financial institutions. So really understanding our clients, knowing our customer really is going to be important going forward. So I think in terms of the key takeaway for 2020 is knowing your customer, having a strong education in compliance. Those are the two key aspects which will get us as compliance officers through 2020.
This is really great conclusion. And also to add up to one of the points that you mentioned about investing and investment needs of people, but also businesses. What you're mentioning is very important, because a lot of businesses are also suffering from the pandemic, being closed down for a couple of months or having to work with restrictions. So we should not forget that also the businesses are suffering from that, and they may be also vulnerable to scams, or as well be part of such in order to cope with the pandemic. So
that's a really great point, and I should have mentioned that. It's the thing with COVID is it doesn't take a specific group. It's individuals. We're looking at customers. We're looking at companies, and we're looking at compliance officers as well. That's one thing I'd potentially expand upon, is say that with the streamlining of compliance related roles, there will be some job losses, no doubt, in the compliance space, and as a result, maybe some hiring freezes that take place. So this really will result in a oversaturated labor market. So to be the best candidate for a role in compliance, you really have to have a strong resume. So having, for better or worse, having certifications, having courses, having key skills which can be demonstrated will be very important going forward. And it's unfortunately not cheap. I talked about financial hardships for individuals because of COVID. Mm-hmm. Taking courses, taking the certifications, that's also very expensive.
Yeah, it's not easy, but it's an investment as well in the person who wants to develop and learn and grow in the future. So I think it's an important investment.
Exactly.
Well, with that, I think we can put a stop to our today's show. Thank you so much for being part and for speaking with us today. In the show notes, I'm going to include the link for your website and the courses that people can check out and maybe read more about once they see the notes.
That's great. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Thank you very much. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to Compliance Time. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to leave us a review, which would help others to find the podcast. Also, don't forget, you can subscribe for email updates on our website, cmpltime.com. Till next week.